The geologist stood in the pasture on a Thursday morning in May, and she told Martin Hayes that he was standing on approximately $4 million worth of gravel. Martin had paid $11,000 for the land 6 months earlier. He had thought he was buying 40 acres of worthless creek bottom that nobody else wanted. He had been wrong about the worthless part. This happened in Fillmore County, Nebraska, in the spring of 2016. The land sat 3 miles south of Geneva in a bend of the West Fork of the Big Blue River. It had been in tax foreclosure for 4 years. The county had tried to sell it twice, and both times the minimum bid had not been met. On the third try, they had dropped the minimum to $250 per acre. Martin Hayes had been the only bidder. He had offered $275. The county had accepted. People at the sale had assumed Martin was making a mistake. The land flooded every spring. It grew nothing but scrub willow and cottonwood saplings. The soil survey classified it as Zook silty clay loam, frequently flooded, which meant it was unsuitable for cultivation. There was no road access except an old 2-track that washed out every time the creek rose. The previous owner had run a few cattle on it in dry years, but that was all it had ever been good for. Martin had known all of this when he bid. He had also known something the other bidders did not know. He had walked the property in October of the previous year, and he had seen the gravel bars along the creek. He had picked up a handful of stones and looked at them closely. The gravel was river rock, well-rounded, mostly quartz and granite. The pieces ranged from the size of a pea to the size of a walnut. Martin had spent 15 years working road construction in 3 states. He knew what good aggregate looked like. This was good aggregate. If you have ever trusted your own judgment when everyone else thought you were wrong, you know how this feels. Hit subscribe. The auction had been held on November 14, 2015, in the assembly room at the Fillmore County Courthouse in Geneva. There were 23 people in attendance. Most of them were there for other properties. The Creek Bottom 40 was lot number 9. The auctioneer, a man named Terry Vosica, had described it as recreational land suitable for hunting or wildlife habitat. He had mentioned the flooding. He had not mentioned gravel because he did not know there was gravel. When Lot 9 came up, Terry had opened the bidding at $250 per acre. Nobody raised a paddle. Terry had waited. He had said, "Folks, this is county land. It needs to go. $250 is the minimum. Somebody give me $250. Martin had raised his paddle. Terry had looked relieved. He had said, "Thank you, I have $250. Do I have $275? Nobody bid. Terry had said, $250 once, $250 twice. Martin had interrupted. He had said, "I will go $275. Terry had looked at him. Terry had said, "Sir, you are bidding against yourself." Martin had said, "I know." Terry had shrugged and said, "Sold to number 41 for $275 per acre." There was a man sitting 2 rows behind Martin whose name was Glenn Verbka. Glenn was 54 years old, and he owned a trucking company in Exeter. He leaned forward and tapped Martin on the shoulder. He said, "You know that land floods, right?" Martin said, "I know." Glenn said, "What are you going to do with it?" Martin said, "I am going to look at it." Glenn had smiled, not meanly. He had just thought it was funny that someone would pay $11,000 for land they were going to look at. Martin Hayes had grown up in York County, Nebraska. He had worked construction since he was 19. He had operated dozers and graders and loaders. He had built roads in Nebraska and Kansas and South Dakota. He had learned how to read land the way a construction foreman reads it. He knew how water moved. He knew where gravel collected. He knew that rivers carried stone downstream and deposited it in bends and bars, and that over time those deposits could be substantial. He had been driving past the Creek Bottom 40 for 2 years. He had noticed the gravel bars when the water was low. In the fall of 2015, he had stopped and walked onto the property. He had followed the creek for half a mile. The gravel was everywhere. It was not just surface scatter. In places where the creek had cut into the bank, he could see gravel beds 4 and 5 feet deep. He had estimated there were tens of thousands of cubic yards on the property, maybe more. He had gone to the county assessor's office and asked about the land. The clerk had told him it was in foreclosure. He had asked when the next auction would be. She had told him November. He had registered to bid. After he bought the land, he did not tell anyone what he planned to do. He paid the $11,000 with a cashier's check. He paid the back taxes, which were $3,200. He took possession of the deed in December. He did nothing with the property until March. In March, he called a geotechnical consulting firm in Lincoln. He spoke to a woman named Dr. Angela Parsons, who specialized in aggregate analysis. He told her he had 40 acres of creek bottom, and he thought there might be gravel on it. He asked if she could come out and evaluate it. She said she could. She charged $800 for a site visit and preliminary assessment. Martin said that was fine. Dr. Parsons drove to Fillmore County on March 23, 2016. Martin met her at the two-track entrance. They walked the property together. She took samples from 6 different locations. She photographed the exposed gravel beds along the creek. She measured the depth of the deposits with a soil probe. She took notes in a field book. She did not say much while she worked. When she finished, she stood in the middle of the pasture and she looked at Martin. She said, "How much did you pay for this land?" Martin said, "11,000. She said, "You underpaid." She explained that the gravel on the property was high-quality Class 5 aggregate, suitable for road base and concrete production. The deposits were extensive. She estimated a minimum of 60,000 cubic yards of recoverable material, possibly as much as 100,000, depending on how deep the beds went. At current market rates, Class 5 aggregates sold for $35 to $45 per cubic yard delivered. Even at the low end, 60,000 cubic yards was worth more than $2 million wholesale. Martin would have extraction costs and permitting costs and haulage costs, but even after expenses, the net value was substantial. Martin had listened to all of this without saying anything. Then he had said, "How do I extract it legally?" Dr. Parsons had said, "You apply for a mining permit with the county and the State Department of Natural Resources. It will take time. You will need an environmental assessment. You will need a reclamation plan. But this land is zoned agricultural and it is already in a floodplain, so you will not have residential objections. If you do it right, you can probably get approved." Martin had thanked her. She had said, "You saw this before you bought it, did not you?" Martin had said yes. She had said, "That was smart." Martin filed for a conditional use permit with Fillmore County in April of 2016. The application required a site plan, an environmental impact statement, and a reclamation proposal. Martin hired Dr. Parsons to prepare the technical documents. She subcontracted the environmental work to a firm in Omaha. The total cost was $14,000. Martin paid it. The County Planning Commission held a public hearing on the permit application in June. 11 people attended. Most of them were neighbors who wanted to know what Martin was planning. Martin stood up and explained that he intended to extract gravel from the creek bottom and sell it to concrete suppliers and road contractors. He said the extraction would be done in phases over a period of 5 to 7 years. He said he would use the existing two-track for truck access, and he would improve it with gravel from the site. He said extraction would only occur in dry months when the creek was low. He said when the work was finished, he would grade the site and seed it with native grasses and leave it as wildlife habitat. One of the neighbors, a farmer named Dale Bitterman, asked if there would be dust. Martin said there would be some, but he would water the roads during dry periods. Another neighbor asked about truck traffic. Martin said there would be trucks, but they would not run at night and they would not run on Sundays. A woman asked if the creek would be damaged. Martin said the creek would not be touched. He was only extracting material from the floodplain bars, not from the active channel. The Planning Commission voted 4-1 to approve the permit. The one dissenting vote came from a commissioner who said he did not think gravel mining belonged in agricultural areas. The other 4 said the land was not being used for agriculture anyway, and at least Martin had a plan to reclaim it when he was done. The state issued the necessary permits in August. Martin began extraction in September. He hired Glenn Verbka's trucking company to haul the gravel. Glenn had laughed when Martin called him. Glenn had said, "You bought that land for gravel?" Martin had said yes. Glenn had said, "I will be damned." Martin contracted with a ready-mix company in York to supply aggregate for their concrete production. He also sold directly to the county road department and to two private contractors who were building farm roads in the area. He charged $38 per cubic yard FOB, which meant the buyer paid for trucking. Most buyers were within 20 miles, so the trucking cost was reasonable. Martin hired a man with an excavator to load the trucks. The excavator operator was paid by the hour. Martin supervised the work himself. In the first year, Martin extracted 12,000 cubic yards. After paying for the excavator operator, the trucking, the permits, the road maintenance, and the equipment rental, he netted $96,000. He paid off the purchase price of the land and the permitting costs and the back taxes. He had $78,000 left over. He put it in a savings account. He continued extraction for 6 more years. By 2022, he had removed approximately 84,000 cubic yards of gravel from the property. The revenue over that period totaled just over $3 million. After all expenses, Martin netted approximately $1,800,000. He stopped extraction in the fall of 2022. The accessible gravel was gone. What remained was either too deep or too close to the active creek channel to extract safely. He graded the site as he had promised. He seeded it with big bluestem and switchgrass. By the spring of 2024, the property looked like native prairie. The county removed the mining permit from the land. It is zoned agricultural again. Martin still owns the 40 acres. He does not farm it. He leases it to a local cattleman who runs a small herd on it during dry years. The lease brings in $800 annually. Martin does not need the money, but he likes knowing the land is being used. Glenn Verbka hauled gravel from Martin's property for 6 years. He tells people at the co-op sometimes that Martin Hayes made close to $2 million on land that sold for $11,000. He says it was the best investment he ever saw anyone make in Fillmore County. He says, "Martin knew what he was looking at. The rest of us just saw a flood zone." Terry Vasica, the auctioneer, retired in 2020. Before he retired, he ran into Martin at a farm sale near Shickley. Terry said, "You are the guy who bought the gravel land." Martin said, "I am." Terry said, "I thought you were crazy." Martin said, "I know you did." Terry said, "I was wrong." Martin said, "You were not the only one." Dale Bitterman, the neighbor who asked about dust, farms land adjacent to Martin's property. He told his son once that Martin Hayes never bragged about the gravel. He just worked quietly and followed the rules and restored the land when he was done. Dale said, "That is how you do business in a small county. You keep your word." Dr. Angela Parsons still works as a geotechnical consultant in Lincoln. She has evaluated dozens of gravel deposits since 2016. She says Martin's site was one of the best she has seen in Nebraska. She says most people would not have recognized it. She says, "He did not need me to tell him there was gravel there. He already knew. He needed me to tell him how much and whether it was worth extracting. That is a different question." Martin Hayes is 53 years old now. He still works construction, but he does not have to. He has enough money to retire if he wants. He says he is not ready to retire. He likes the work. He bought a newer pickup truck in 2023. It is a Ford F-250. It is the first new vehicle he has ever owned. He paid cash. People in Fillmore County still talk about the gravel land. They talk about it the way people talk about a good hand of cards or a horse that came in at long odds. They say Martin got lucky. Martin does not correct them. He knows it was not luck. It was observation. He saw something others missed because he knew what to look for. That is not luck. That is knowledge applied. He bought the cheapest land at the auction because nobody else wanted it. What was beneath it was worth $4 million wholesale. He extracted half of that before the economics stopped making sense. He walked away with close to $2 million. The land is still there. It still floods every spring. It still grows cottonwoods and willows. But for 6 years it also grew wealth, quietly, one truckload at a time.